I say India and China, what do they have in common? The first answer that comes to our mind is a huge population. Whatever the drawbacks be, but we do get noticed because of a sheer number. So does number have significance? Definitely. It is obvious that we notice organisms because they reproduce. If there were to be only one non-reproducing member of a particular kind, it is doubtful that we would have noticed its existence. It is the large number of organisms belonging to a single species that bring them to our notice. Reproduction is definitely one of the most important life-maintaining process on this earth. It is the only means of multiplication and perpetuation for a species, because older members of a species undergo aging and die out. So, to maintain individuals of our own kind on this earth, reproduction is the only mechanism. So let us discuss the various aspects of reproduction in different plants and animals. Before we delve further into the details of this topic, let me tell you, we have divided this chapter into 3 episodes. The first episode introduces what is reproduction, what is the significance of reproduction, and the 2 important types of reproduction. We shall also be discussing in detail the types of asexual reproduction in both plants and animals. The second episode deals with sexual reproduction in flowering plants, sexual reproduction in animals, advantages of sexual reproduction. The final episode would deal with human male reproductive system and the female reproductive system, birth control methods, and the sexually transmitted diseases. Reproduction is defined as a biological process in which an organism gives rise to young ones or offsprings, similar to itself. Did you listen to the definition carefully? It said, reproduction involves organisms producing offsprings which are similar to oneself. It said similar. I would want you to recall similar triangles and congruent triangles. Congruent triangles are those triangles which are exact copy of each other. And similar triangles have at least one difference in them. Here also, offsprings are not exact copy of their parents. So from where do these differences arise in their offsprings? A basic event in reproduction is the copying of DNA. And it is this DNA which is responsible for bringing about variation. Cells use chemical reactions to create copies of DNA. These 2 copies of DNA in a reproducing cell will separate after some time. But before the DNA strands separate, a cell divides into 2. And then the 2 DNA strands, each one of them goes into its respective cell. And thus, a single cell would have divided into 2 cells. But do remember, no biochemical reaction is error-free. Which means, when the DNA is getting copied, it is always with some variations each time. Thus, when the progeny is receiving the same DNA, it is still with some variation. If the variation is useful and is transmitted to the progeny, then it helps in its survival. And if it is not, it results in the death of the cell. This inbuilt tendency for variation is the basis for evolution, be it a multicellular or a unicellular organism. For example, in a polar region, black color can be identified very easily. And if there were an organism to give birth to offsprings one of which were to be black in color, then the predator would easily identify it and it would get killed. This would result in that trait not being further transmitted to the other offsprings. On one hand, consistency of DNA copying is very essential to produce body design features which are essential for an organism to survive in a given habitat. But at the same time, producing variants is also essential because it helps them to survive during changing environment. Hence, variation is very useful for the continuation of a species in a given environment. And if it doesn't, then probably that species may get wiped out over a period of time, as probably happened with the woolly mammoth. Hence, do remember, reproduction is a very crucial and vital process for all living organisms. Some organisms, like Euglena, just split into two parts and produce new Euglena. A Hydra grows out of its parent body in the form of a bud. A snake or a bird hatches out from the egg. Human babies, kittens, and puppies are born to their mothers, which means every species has its own way of reproducing. So let us study the two main methods of reproduction, asexual and sexual mode of reproduction. The production of offsprings from a single parent without the involvement of sex cells is called asexual reproduction. It is normally found in organisms which have a simple body structure, like, for example, a unicellular animal like Plasmodium, or a unicellular plant like Chlamydomonas, or maybe even a microbe like bacteria, or sometimes even multicellular animals like Hydra and Planaria, or sometimes multicellular plants like rose and bryophyllum all undergo asexual mode of reproduction. The production of new organism from two parents involving their sex cells is called as sexual reproduction. The two parents are called as male and female. Human beings, cats, dogs, fishes, frogs all reproduce by this method. In asexual reproduction, few body cells of the parent organism undergo repeated cell division to form two or more new organisms of the same kind. Asexual reproduction is of 6 different types: fission, budding, spore formation, regeneration, fragmentation, and vegetative propagation. In the process of fission, a unicellular organism splits or divides into two or more nearly equal-sized organisms. Fission is basically of two types: binary fission and multiple fission. In binary fission, the organism splits into two new organisms, and in multiple fission, it splits into more than two organisms. Depending upon the plane of division, binary fission is further classified into 3 types: irregular, longitudinal, and transverse binary fission. Irregular binary fission is shown by amoeba. When the amoeba cell has reached its maximum size of growth, the nucleus lengthens to form a dumbbell-shaped nucleus, and then it divides into 2 parts. After that, the cytoplasm divides into 2 parts, 1 part around each nucleus. And in this way, one parent amoeba divides to form 2 small daughter amoebae. Longitudinal binary fission is shown by Euglena and Leishmania. Let us see how Euglena divides. When binary fission occurs along a longitudinal plane, 2 similar daughter individuals are formed. This process is called longitudinal binary fission. Transverse binary fission is shown by Paramecium and Planaria. Let us see how Paramecium divides. When binary fission occurs along a transverse plane, so as to form dissimilar daughter individuals. It is called as transverse binary fission. Let us learn something more about multiple fission. Sometimes, during unfavorable conditions, in some unicellular organisms like Plasmodium and bacteria, a cyst or a protective wall develops. Inside the cyst, the parent nucleus keeps on dividing many a times without being followed by division of the cytoplasm. Sometime later, bits of cytoplasm surround each of the nuclei, and later on, a thin membrane also develops around each of these nuclei. This results in the formation of 1,000 new individuals called daughter individuals. Each of these individuals are released during favorable condition. So now, let us try and summarize whatever we've learned. The first type of asexual reproduction that we just learned about is fission, which is subcategorized as binary and multiple fission. Binary fission is further classified as irregular, longitudinal, and transverse binary fission. Budding is a fairly simple process to understand. In this, a new individual is formed from specialized cells, either external or internal, which consist of regenerative cell or cells in it. We are going to take two examples of Hydra, which is a multicellular organism found in water, and a unicellular yeast, which happens to be a unicellular fungi. Although both the organisms show budding, they do show some differences as well in the same process. So let us first have a look at Hydra. In Hydra, a small bud or projection is produced by repeated cell division. Gradually, after some time, the bud differentiates to form a tiny Hydra by development of tentacles and mouth. After some time, the tiny Hydra separates from the parent cell. In case of yeast, a small projection develops on the outside wall of the parent. The parent nucleus divides into two parts. One part of the nucleus migrates into the bud, and this forms a tiny new yeast cell, which happens to separate from the parent cell. Budding in yeast is, however, so fast that before the bud has separated from the parent cell, it itself forms another bud, and the process continues. And in this way, a chain of cells which remain attached to the parent cell is formed. Ultimately, however, each of the bud gets separated from each other, and they form individual yeast cells. So children, do remember, budding in Hydra is due to cell division, whereas in case of yeast, it is simply because of a projection of the cell wall. Also, there is a chain of cells which remain attached to the parent cell in yeast, which never happens in case of Hydra. Have you ever seen a brown structure on the underside of a fern leaf and wondered what is it? That is a sori, which is a cluster of spores. Let us have a look at this fungi growing on the bread. Spores again. Another method of asexual reproduction is spore formation, wherein the parent produces several microscopic reproductive units called spores inside a spore case. When this spore case bursts, it releases several spores into the air. These airborne spores land on the soil or food, and under favorable conditions, germinate and produce new organisms. Most fungi, like Rhizopus mucor, all bacteria, and many non-flowering plants, like ferns and mosses, reproduce by the method of spore formation. Regeneration is the formation of a whole new organism or few parts from its own body parts. Many animals, like Hydra, Planaria, starfish, all show regeneration. In Planaria, if it gets cut into many pieces, each piece can grow into the whole organism. It shows the process of growth and development. However, do not forget that regeneration is a process which is seen in simple organisms with a simple body organization. In multicellular organisms, which have a complex body organization, have specialized cells which form tissues. Tissues form organs, and organs form organ system. And those organ systems taken together ultimately form an organism. Having such a complex structure, regeneration becomes a difficult process. However, they do show regeneration of some parts of their body. Like a lizard can regenerate its tail. A newt or a salamander can regenerate its limb as well as its tail. The breaking up of the body of a simple multicellular organism into two or more pieces, each of which grows into a complete new organism, is called fragmentation. Microscopic plant like a Spirogyra filament breaks up into two or more pieces, each of which develops into a complete Spirogyra filament. So now you must be wondering, what is the difference between fragmentation, fission, and regeneration? Fragmentation is a natural process of growth in a plant like Spirogyra, whereas regeneration is a process wherein a multicellular organism breaks into pieces accidentally and then only